Welcome to Psychoanalysis Part 2. In this lecture, we're going to continue and build upon some of the basics that Sigmund Freud was arguing for if you're going to do psychoanalysis successfully. As you'll recall, in the first lecture, we talked about a couple of the problems that got in the way of people being able to really go back into their pasts, uncover hidden and long buried, perhaps long repressed experiences, and which are now perhaps unconscious, and to make them conscious. Remember that when you do that, according to Freud, when you make the connection between what symptom you're experiencing and then what caused it in the past, when you are able to name that cause historically and re-experience it emotionally in the counseling session, you will receive not only mental clarity, but you will receive relief from the physical symptoms that would often plague Freud's patients. We talked about how the majority of his patients early on were primarily women, and they were suffering from what we now would call conversion disorders or somatization disorders. Back then, they were diagnosed as having hysteria. And remember also, we talked about how Freud said, it's all nice to be able to say that we should go back and reconstruct the past and re-experience these things. But remember, he encountered lots of problems in the name of resistance. It seemed that wherever Sigmund Freud turned, he encountered resistance. If he tried to get his patients to talk about the past, they would cover it up. If he hypnotized them, they couldn't quite put all the pieces together. And when you brought them out of hypnosis, if you confronted them with what they said, it sometimes helped, but oftentimes people would deny it even if they were told exactly what they said. As we'll come to find out here soon when we talk about dreams, Freud found that people even censored themselves when talking about what they dreamt about the night before. And in fact, sometimes they even censored themselves in the dreams themselves. We'll also talk about the defense mechanisms that people will employ to protect themselves, to protect their ego from the painful truth of reality. And there are all sorts of defense mechanisms that we'll talk about that I told you that you need to memorize from your text. So moving along here briskly, patients will resist. Resistance is more or less when a patient blocks self-honesty out of a sense of threat to another part of our personality. You've probably read before that Sigmund Freud believed that the basic components of the personality were the id, the ego, and the superego. And the id, the ego, and the superego were three forces that operated in a closed system, meaning if you increase one part of the personality, there must be a corresponding decrease in another part of the personality. You can't have, for example, a strong id, a strong ego, and a strong superego. There needs to be give and take between the three. Why do we resist? Well, because for the most part, there are lots of things in our lives that we would rather not admit to. There are things that we would rather not admit to in polite company. And in order to function in life, we can't be overwhelmed by all the unpleasant truths about ourselves. So what we do is we kind of lie to ourselves or kid ourselves and distract ourselves from focusing too much on the unpleasant news of life, and we move on. And these are designed to keep us balanced. But notice that Freud says that we will try to maintain balance and homeostasis even if it's done in an unhealthy way. So just another way of saying that is, just because a person is getting up every day and going to school and going to work and more or less functioning, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's healthy. A lot of people are balanced out, but that only means that they've been able to compensate in one area of life to compensate for another area of life that's not so healthy. So we strive for balance, and when something tries to upset that balance, when someone comes in and says, hey, have you considered doing this, or have you considered changing, or have you considered admitting the truth, or have you considered making amends with that person that you're at odds with, or have you considered maybe quitting your job, or have you considered confronting your wife about this problem, or whatever, people generally resist that. They want to try to reinforce the status quo, and they don't want to be told that how they're living their lives is mistaken. So people resist. The id, the ego, and the superego, those three parts to the personality, are governed, according to Freud, by three principles. The id is governed by the pleasure principle, meaning the id is the part of our personality that wants to experience pleasure. Basically, the id part of our personality says if it feels good, do it. If it is sexually attractive, have sex with it. If it looks appetizing to eat it. If it looks conquerable, conquer it, overwhelm it, overpower it. You may have seen those old cartoons where a character may have been faced with some sort of moral dilemma, and the cartoonist drew an angel on one shoulder telling them the good thing that they should do, and then they drew a devil on the other shoulder, appearing over the other shoulder, telling them the bad thing that they ought to do. Well, the id is like the devil on your shoulder. The id is selfish, it's powerful, it wants to dominate, it wants to coerce, it wants to manipulate, it wants to control, it basically wants to be in charge. It's kind of like a wild animal. And the ego is what lies in between the id and the superego. We'll come back to the ego in just a moment. The superego is governed by the ideal principle, or the what you might call the moral or morality principle. The superego is that part of you that wants to be a perfect angel, a good boy, a good girl, someone who's obedient, someone who fits in, someone who's conventional, someone who does the right thing, someone who gets good grades, someone who does right by society, someone who has a good reputation, someone basically who gets along and is a very good citizen. And what Freud said was that if your life is dominated too much by the id or too much by the superego, you'll have problems. For example, if you're constantly giving in to your appetites and doing what the id tells you to do, you'll probably land in jail, or you'll probably die. But if you're constantly giving in to what the superego tells you to do, you're going to be boring and dull, and you're not going to be happy. So what he says is that the ego, which is really kind of the sense of self, that's kind of the brain or the head that exists in between those two characters that appear on either shoulder. The ego tries to achieve balance between the two. Like basically be a good citizen and go after the things in this life that are going to be most rewarding for you, but also try to have some fun. And it tries to keep the reins on the id and the superego pretty tight so that neither one of those tries to take over the entire personality. So some terms that you'll often hear to talk about the id, the ego, and the superego, I already mentioned one of them. One of them is a closed system. Again, a closed system means that if you have any increase in any part of that personality, there's also going to be a subsequent or corresponding decrease in another part of the personality. Another term that's important is dynamic, meaning that they interact with each other a lot. When you do one kind of action, it has an effect on the other part of it. Freud believed that the id, the ego, and the superego are all very much determined. They are deterministic, meaning they're a part of our biology. They're inborn. It's a part of our instincts. That these are things that we inherit genetically from our ancestors. So there's no fighting it. He said everybody has this part of them. There's no use trying to deny it because it's all true. We all have this kind of stuff. Now I've given you a couple of key terms, but the key term you need to know about the personality, about the id, the ego, and the superego is the term conflict. Conflict within the self. Self-conflict is at the heart of what Freud talks about in terms of our personality. He believed that everybody, more or less, lives in conflict. There's that part of us that says, here's what I want to do, but here's what I ought to do. Here's what I'm tempted to do, but here's what I'd better do. I feel like calling in sick this morning and not going to school or work. Yeah, but on the other hand, if I don't, it's going to be more work for me, and maybe I should just try to fight through this. In every situation, there's that selfish part of ourself that wants to exert itself, and then there's this more mature part of ourself that tries to tell us this is what we ought to do. And in the end, the ego will make the final decision. But always this assumes that we're living in conflict with ourselves. And there's a lot of tension. Each one is vying for supremacy, and it can be pretty tormenting for a lot of people to live this way. You've all seen an example of a very highly conflicted person. They're a person that's constantly ruminating, constantly going over decisions in their mind. Should I do this or should I do this? What's the right thing? What should I do? Help. Now, what will happen is Freud believed that you will develop symptoms such as becoming depressed, maybe having some physiological symptoms like headaches or stomach aches or things like this, you will develop symptoms when, especially when your id is trying to express itself, but an overly controlling superego will not let the id express itself. So imagine you're in a situation where you're very frustrated, and let's say like you have a coworker who's constantly bothering you, constantly making life miserable for you, constantly showing up late, constantly taking the credit and giving you the blame. And you've been meaning to have a real sit down conversation with this person for a long time and tell them off, or to give them a piece of your mind. But no, you always control yourself. You're controlled, you're not going to say it. You keep it locked up inside. What Freud believed is that tension is going to build. And you're going to get more and more and more tense. And even though you might not actually ever say anything to your coworker, what will happen to you is that you'll develop symptoms on the side that are actually because of your indecision and your refusal to tell the truth. So you might, for example, start to gain weight. Or you might, for example, start to become sick on a daily basis. Or your work might start to suffer. Or you might start making some self-destructive decisions. What the key is that Freud believed that each of these things that happens is not something that just happened out of nowhere. It happened because you didn't let the full truth of yourself reveal itself. You were too over-controlled, you were wound up too tight, and it's almost like trying to. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of swimming in a pool and you try to push down something that wants to float irresistibly. I don't know if you've ever had like a water cooler get into the pool and you try to push it down, but it just stubbornly wants to float. And the harder you try to push it down, the more it actively resists. And so Freud said that these kinds of symptoms would start popping up in other areas of your life if you didn't take care of them in real time when they emerged. Another form of resistance that Freud talked about, and you do need to know this for your exam, is defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms come from the ego, and Freud believed that almost all of them are unconscious, meaning you and me and other people, we will use these kinds of defense mechanisms without knowing that we're doing it. Now, there's one defense mechanism that Freud talks about that is very much done consciously. It's done when we are fully aware of the fact that we're doing it, and that is denial. Denial is when we know that there's something that needs addressing, we know that there's something wrong, we know that there's something we probably should call attention to, there's probably something we need to confront in somebody else or in ourselves, but we consistently push it to the periphery of our lives and we distract ourselves from it and we don't ever address it. It's basically turning your back on reality. So that is done very consciously, but almost all the other ones are done and we don't even know that we do it. So the most fundamental defense mechanism is what Freud called repression. Repression is when you've done something wrong or something bad has happened to you that would cause shame, and you would never, ever, ever in a million years want to talk about it. And so what do? The ego decides it's going to just forget it. You're just going to forget it. And you act as if it never even happened. Now, if you did know that it happened and you're denying it, that's denial. That's when you know that this thing happened, you're just trying your hardest to ignore it. It's like you're trying to push something down under the surface of the water with all of your might. Repression is that your ego just kind of does yourself the favor of just conveniently forgetting that it ever happened. If you've ever done something really wrong and you feel badly about it, sometimes your mind will just forget it. And you'll go on living your life as if it never even happened and you don't ever even focus on it. So that's one way that we defend ourselves against the unpleasant, harsh reality of life. Another defense mechanism Freud said was called projection. Now, projection is when you take something about yourself that's really unpleasant. Say like there's a personality quirk that you have that you don't like at all. Say like you have a temper problem. So say like every once in a while you become too angry and you lose your temper. But you don't like to admit that you lose your temper. You don't want to admit that this is the kind of person you are. So what you'll do is, to protect yourself from harm, you'll give that attribute to someone else, whether they lose their temper or not. So they'll say, you have a major anger problem, or you have a major temper problem, when in fact you're the one that has the temper problem. So again, projection is when you attribute something unpleasant about yourself onto somebody else. So like, here's an example of that, and this one comes from my own life. I love playing basketball, and for years and years, I would play one-on-one basketball with my friends. And because I practiced all the time, I was usually pretty good and I would win a lot of games. Well, one time I started playing one-on-one basketball with a guy that really didn't play basketball at all. But you know what happens whenever you play against someone that is worse than you? All that time that you're playing, you're getting worse, but that person's getting better because you're not playing against better competition. Your skills stay the same, but that person's skills are constantly improving. And finally, after months and months of playing basketball, the day finally came when this guy that I was playing basketball against, he finally beat me. And I was so mad when he finally beat me, I slammed the basketball down on the ground and I said to him, "You are so competitive." Now, I was caught red-handed. If Sigmund Freud had been there that day, he would have said, "Aha, I wonder what's going on here." I was projecting. Who was really the competitive person? I was the competitive person. But because I didn't like the fact that I was a competitive person and didn't like losing, I gave that unpleasant characteristic to him. I just switched it over to him, and my ego tried to protect itself from that reality. Other defense mechanisms include reaction formation. Reaction formation is when you do the exact opposite of what you want to do that is unhealthy. So here's an example. Let's say like you've had a really tough day at school, like everything went wrong, and you walk into your house, and as you're walking into the house, you trip over a let's say like somebody accidentally left a fork for some reason, a kitchen utensil, a fork on the floor, and you tripped over it or you kicked it and you hurt yourself. And for a split second, you wanted to take the fork. You were so mad at the end of this long day. You wanted to take the fork and throw it through the window, or break the fork, or throw it away, or slam it down on the ground. But you catch yourself before you do that, and what do? You calmly walk into the kitchen, put the fork into the sink, and you gently clean it, and then you put it away very carefully. Now, you didn't feel like doing any of that, but what you did is you caught yourself in the middle of wanting to do something much worse to that fork. You wanted to really hurt it. So a reaction formation is whenever you're about to do something really bad and you catch yourself and then you do the exact opposite of what you wanted to do. Another example is displacement. It's kind of closely related to that. That's where you have a hostile feeling for someone and you want to give them a piece of your mind, but instead what you do is that you take it out on somebody else. Bullying is a classic example of that. Most people who are bullies are people who themselves were treated poorly, usually by an abusive parent or by someone else who had bullied them. And so what do they do in return? Well, they're too weak to be able to stand up to that person who's stronger than them, so they take it out on somebody else. That other person didn't deserve any of this poor treatment, but they're displacing their feelings onto somebody else. Yet another defense mechanism is called rationalization. Rationalization is when you use logic or reason to try to explain why you have failed. So, like for example, if you get a bad grade on a test, you might say, well, I hate that teacher. The teacher's no good, and that's why I got a bad grade on the test. But in reality, you got a bad grade because you didn't study. Or if you say, that test was too hard, it was an unfair test. That's a rationalization. You're using logic and reason to explain why you failed when in reality, you just failed. It's your fault. You have nobody to blame but yourself. So we talked about an example of rationalization in our first lecture when Freud blamed his not getting a professor's post because of anti-Semitism. Could it have been that there was anti-Semitism directed against him? Of course, that's entirely possible. But it's also possible that he blamed his failure to get a professorship on his race and being treated poorly because of his race. There was one defense mechanism that Freud talked about that he considered to be the healthiest defense mechanism, and he called this one sublimation. Sublimation is when you take something negative that happened to you in the past and you kind of translate it or channel it into something positive. Like, let's say that you were the victim of a violent crime when you were younger, and so what you do about it is, rather than becoming hostile to the entire world or becoming an alcoholic or becoming someone who avoids life altogether, you take a martial arts class and you learn how to feel more confident about yourself, to try to engage in some self-defense, and you do something more pro-social. And Freud still believed that this was at its heart a defense mechanism because you're not really acknowledging the deep down truth of what happened. But he believed that when you can do something that's more pro-social and benefits society, that might really help. Like another example might be, what if you grew up in a home where there was lots of abuse, and you never go to about it with a counselor, you never really get any kind of healing from it, but what you decide to do instead is that you're going to have children and you're going to raise them in an absolutely safe and loving home. That's a great thing to do, and if you can do that, that's fantastic. But Freud would say that at heart, that's still kind of a defense mechanism. You're living your life in reaction to something bad that happened to you that you haven't really fully acknowledged. So that's sublimation. Other defense mechanisms include regression. Regression just means that during a time of stress, you'll go back to an earlier stage of development. The classic example of this is sometimes when a person feels overwhelmed with stress, they'll get into their bed and they will curl up into the fetal position, almost like they're staging the shape that they took when they were in the womb. Or sometimes I don't know if you've ever heard a grown man or a grown woman start to cry like a child. When they're under a certain amount of stress, they may become very childlike. That's called regression. It's almost like instead of moving forward, you go back in time to an earlier stage of development. Next is introjection. This is when you adopt characteristics of people around you that you consider to be powerful in order to defend yourself against your own weaknesses, to defend yourself against the reality that you may not be measuring up. Narcissists do this a lot too. They will sometimes take on characteristics that are not theirs, not because they're strong, but because they're weak. And they want to think very strong thoughts, and they only want to think the way that other strong, capable people think. Next is compensation. This is when you make up for a perceived weakness in yourself by making them strengths or by belittling their importance. So say like I knew a kid in high school, for example, who was the skinniest kid I ever saw in my life. I think by the time he was a high school sophomore, he probably weighed about 85 pounds. He was really, really, really skinny. And I noticed during the summer he was able to get into the gym, and he was working out every single day for hours and hours and hours and hours. Well, that's compensation. By the time he finished up his junior year, he was still very lean, but he had a lot of muscle tone. Well, he's compensating. So that's a defense mechanism. But another thing he could have done, instead of lifting weights, he could have said that being strong is not important. What if he had said, well, yeah, I'm skinny, but I don't need to be strong. Strong people are idiots. I don't need to be a strong person. So he's compensating by talking about how unimportant it is, when in fact, deep down, he really does think it's important. He's just very skinny. All right, so those are some of the classic Freudian defense mechanisms. They're also called ego defense mechanisms because Freud believed that they originated in the ego part of the personality. Okay. Now, Freud said there are other forms of resistance. One other form of resistance was called transference. Transference is when a patient unconsciously develops feelings, positive or negative, but the patient unconsciously develops feelings for the therapist that are not based in reality, but based on that person's emotional needs or previous experiences. Like a classic example could be with Sigmund Freud himself, he smoked a cigar. And it could be that what if one of his patients just immediately did not like him? Not because of anything about Sigmund Freud, but because Freud smoked a cigar, and her father smoked a cigar, and she did not like her father because there was a bad relationship there, and so now she doesn't like Sigmund Freud, not because of Freud, but because Freud reminds her of her own father. That's transference. Or sometimes a patient will develop feelings of sexual attraction for a counselor. And a good counselor knows that these are not based in reality, these are based on projections and based on fantasies that usually have to do with the patient's previous experiences, not based on anything in reality. So at first, Freud really hated transference. He said it got in the way, it interrupted the therapeutic process, it's a distortion of reality, etc., etc. But what he ended up doing was admitting that in the long term, a therapist can learn a lot about a patient from transference. Because over time, the analyst will begin to experience what it must be like to live in the patient's world. Like, for example, I remember working with a client one time, and somebody else had warned me about this client, saying, this client causes all sorts of chaos everywhere she goes. And I said, okay, well, that's fine. Well, then I began to see the client, and I didn't notice anything, but little by little by little by little, the client started creating all sorts of chaos. And I thought to myself, wow, this person's really reacting to me very strongly and creating all sorts of chaos in my life and making my life very difficult. What in the world is going on here? Well, as negative as that was, it also helped me as a counselor, because then I was able to point out, I noticed that when I'm working with you, I feel like I'm trying to put out a lot of fires, and I notice that you have all sorts of requests for me that are you're very demanding of my time. And this is a very teachable moment. So a term here is called a repetitive interaction pattern. A repetitive interaction pattern is when the same kind of situation keeps on getting created based on your repeated interactions with another person. And so in this case, transference can be very helpful. But that's not the only problem. There's also countertransference. Countertransference is when a therapist develops feelings for the patient. And again, those are not based on anything in reality. They're usually based on what the therapist's own issues are that are being brought into therapy. It's the therapist's baggage this time. So with transference, it's basically the patient's baggage. With countertransference, it's the therapist's baggage. And again, it's usually based on unfulfilled needs of the therapist. And it can, just like transference, it can cloud judgment and end up doing harm. But just like transference, it's one thing that if the therapist becomes aware of it and learns to deal with it, it can be very, very helpful for therapy going forward. So the best thing to do is to acknowledge them as realities, because we can learn from them, but manage their overall effects. And here is what I was referring to earlier. Another form of resistance that Freud encountered was in dreams. Freud talked a lot about dreams. Now, he didn't talk about dreams quite as much as his protege and disciple, Carl Jung, but he still talked about dreams. In fact, his most famous book that he ever published was called The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1900. He actually wrote it in 1899, but he wanted to publish it in 1900 because he thought the year 1900 sounded new and modern and innovative at the time. So anyway, that was his most famous book, The Interpretation of Dreams. And in that book, he called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, meaning that our dreams are so important and so vital to understanding who it is that we are, that it's absolutely essential that every therapist should really pay close attention to a patient's dreams. If Freud were alive today and he saw most of the way counseling operates, and he would sit there and wait and wait and wait and realize that nobody in the therapy session was going to talk about dreams, he would say, why are you guys even bothering to have a therapy session if you're not going to talk about dreams? Dreams were everything to Sigmund Freud because he believed they led us to a discovery of who it is that we are. But the problem is that even when we're dreaming, when we're not fully conscious, we still censor ourselves during our dreams, and our defense mechanisms are alive and well in the middle of our dreams, which was very frustrating, of course, for Freud, because at first he believed that when we were dreaming, we were completely an open book. So what Freud did is he said, when someone tells you about what they dreamt about the night before, there are two things to focus on. There's the manifest content of the dream, and then the latent content of the dream. The manifest content is what the person basically tells you the dream was about. The latent content is what that dream actually means deep down. So Freud always believed that when we dreamt about something, you should never take something at face value in a dream. It should always, almost all of the things that we dream about point to something deeper within ourselves. So for example, he said that it's very rare that a patient would ever have, every once in a while, a patient could have a sex dream, but they usually will not have them, and they'll certainly not talk about them the next day. But let's say like someone did have such a dream. What Freud would say is that you're not likely to actually dream about a sexual encounter or a sexual act. What you're much more likely to dream about is something else that stands for sex. So a classic example of this is Freud said that any dream that you had that involved you moving inside of a house, like walking from a bedroom or walking to a kitchen or walking to a bathroom or walking. Any dream in which you're inside of a house is actually a dream about your own body. And any dream that involves you being in the bedroom is a sex dream, whether you know it's a sex dream or not. And so what Freud would say is get people to talk about the content of the dream, and over time they will eventually, the eventual true meaning of the dream will come out. So that's the manifest content would be, I had a dream about walking down the street and I almost got hit by a car, and I woke up right before I got hit by the car. And I woke up and I was gasping for breath, gasping for air. The latent content could be that the road represents life, and I'm walking down this road and I'm living my life, and the farther I get, the older I get. And there are all these things that are coming at me trying to stop me from my goals. And a car that almost hits me could be something that could derail me, like maybe it's my past catching up to me, or if I'm an alcoholic, maybe I'm going to develop a diseased liver, or if I've been eating very poorly, maybe I'll have a heart attack. But the car might be something in my life that's trying to stop me from living my life. And so it's not just a dream about a car that almost hit me, it's this thing in my life that needs to be talked about in counseling that I haven't talked about fully. So that is Sigmund Freud. And remember, his book is called The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1900. So we've talked a lot about what causes people to be unhealthy, and we'll continue to talk about that a little bit more as well. But we also now need to talk about what the goals of psychoanalysis are. Remember, psychoanalysis is not just a theory of personality, it's also a type of therapeutic intervention. So the first is to make the unconscious conscious. So for Freud, it's very important that the big part of our lives that is unconscious needs to be made conscious. We need to know why we do what we do. Secondly, we discover this truth. We discover the conscious part of ourselves, or we discover the unconscious part of ourselves and work it out by working through these resistances and defenses that prevent us from being able to accept the truth about ourselves. Third, that most of the reason why we are defended and why we are resistant is because we're protecting ourselves from some sort of trauma, some sort of emotional pain, or some sort of vulnerability. And so what Freud tries to do, and what a good analyst tries to do, is to get a person to re-experience the trauma somehow in therapy, in a safe environment. And the idea is that if you can have this kind of emotional release, which is called a catharsis, a lot of our tension will be released. He almost uses it in kind of sexualized terms, like this emotional sexual experience, like you're releasing all of these horrible feelings that you had previously been holding on to too tightly. And if you just get to the right point to where the truth can come out, this will happen to you. The term catharsis, you need to know the term catharsis has another related term called, that's not written here, it's called cathexis. Cathexis is spelled Cathexis, cathexis. Cathexis and catharsis are related to each other in this way. If you are interested in something or emotionally invested in something and you spend a lot of time thinking about something, that's called cathexis. Cathexis is when something becomes very important to you and you think about it all the time. Well, if that happens, you're building up a lot of pressure because you're giving a lot of time and energy to it. Catharsis is the release of that same pressure. Does that make sense? So cathexis is when you start to build up the tension because you're thinking about it all the time, and catharsis is the release of that tension once you've decided to let it go. Freud believed that if you experience that healthy catharsis, you will become healthier. So then what you try to do in psychoanalysis is reconstruct the entire personality so that your id, ego, and superego can live harmoniously. Well, what does it mean for the id, ego, and the superego to live harmoniously? Well, basically, like we were saying earlier, when the ego gives permission for the id to have a little bit of fun, but for the superego to basically still make sure you're going to be a good citizen. And it's up to the ego to decide what that balance is going to be. Basically, Freud believed that you'll be a healthy person when you decide to live on your own terms and try to live without guilt or without any real obligation to anybody else. He believed, his famous quote was, "Love in the end is the final therapy." In other words, when you can love yourself and love somebody else, that's how you know you're healthy. He believed that we should all eventually experience the freedom to live, to love, and to work, and to accept ourselves without guilt. So those are good questions to ask each of you. Do you feel free to live without guilt? Do you feel free to love someone else without hesitation? Do you feel free to work without feeling like you may do it wrong? Are you too much of a perfectionist? Freud would try to say you need to get to the point to where it doesn't bother you so much how you do. You should live on your own terms. Uh, Freud never included God in any of his reasoning. He remained an atheist, even though there seemed to be a few examples in his writing of where he actually still held on to the idea of the existence of God. Publicly, he maintained that he was an atheist until the end of his life. So what I want to do is I want to introduce to you part of what we're going to do this week for your forum. I had said that you're going to be watching some therapy videos, but in fact, what we're going to be doing instead is you're going to be working through this case study of John. So let me read to you the case study of John, and I'm going to ask you a few questions here in a couple of slides, and that's what you're going to be doing for your forum. So you'll notice that's slide number 11. Slide number 12, slide number 13, and then slide number 14 is your case formulation of John. So actually, you can read this on your own. It's pointless for me to read this out loud to you. And I will actually post these questions for you in the forum that I will put on Moodle for you guys.